Hello and welcome to this episode of Big Ideas in Supply Chain. My name is Matt Spooner and I'm an industry thought leader at Kinaxis. My guest today will be Bram Desmet, Chief Executive Officer at Solventure. Now, Bram is a highly successful business leader, an author, and a supply chain thought leader and influencer. I don't know how he has so much time to cover all of these activities. Today, Bram and I will be discussing sales and operations planning and where do we go from here. I know that this is a topic that Bram is absolutely passionate about, and I really share his passion around the whole topic of sales and operations planning and integrated business planning. But I want to start off, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about sales and operations planning recently, and we've seen what's been happening over the pandemic. Bram, would it really be an exaggeration to say that over the last 30 years, sales and operations planning has really failed to deliver its promises?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly fair statement, Matt. I came into supply chain around 20 years ago. I was educated with the books of Thomas Wallace, where the S&OP process is explained. It's also explained what it should be used for. It's seemingly simple, but I would say if I come into companies, I see common diseases. And what are common diseases? There's a lack of buy-in from the sales side, and salespeople don't see the added value of contributing into a forecasting process. We struggle with aligning the operational forecast and the financial forecast. So the idea was to come to one set of numbers, but I still see multiple sets of numbers. And I would say we sometimes even fail or lack some of the fundamentals, like good master data, which is an absolute basic. But if I see the struggles in companies with some of those basic things, it's a huge problem. And I think in a certain sense, for non-supply chain people, there's also sometimes a kind of people are disillusioned in the sense that all the dreams that the supply chain community has promised with S&OP, we have not necessarily been able to make the dreams true or to deliver upon our promises. So yeah, I would say that we do have an issue. It's or at least a perception issue.
And do you think that part of this might be that a typical S&OP cycle takes 4 weeks to go through, sometimes can be even longer. I've seen companies with S&OP cycles of 6 or even 8 weeks, which means that by the time you're getting to the decision-making process, the data is practically 2 months out of date. Is that something that you commonly see as well?
Well, I would say that technology can make a huge difference here. That where I see the long cycles, people would typically be using poor systems or Excel systems, and drawing historical sales data from a BI, splitting it up in Excels and sending it to regions, and then having to get it back, and then do the RCCP in another type of Excel. So the more manual the process is, the slower it will be. But I think that's in general. So I would say the systems are available to do good S&OP. So the problem is not necessarily the systems. The systems can shorten the cycles, but it's probably in other elements like people think they need to do S&OP for supply chain, so it's still considered to be a supply chain process rather than a business process. Yeah, and maybe also supply chain doesn't have the credibility in the executive team, to drive the other departments in participating in a cross-functional process. Also, the silo mentality in a lot of executive teams remains quite dominant, and though S&OP maybe could be the process that breaks the silos, maybe as supply chain we are still lacking the credibility or the impact in the executive team to actually break the silos. That's a couple of struggles I do see which we are still faced with, I would say, despite the fact that the technology is there and the technology is available.
You're painting, or between us, we're painting a bit of a gloomy picture about sales and operations planning. And I think that we've seen supply chains being really disrupted over the last 3 years with the pandemic, and then there's the supply chain shortages and political and geopolitical disruption. And to be frank, a lot of organizations are now pretty disillusioned with their S&OP process. Um, is it time that we abandon S&OP? Do we actually need S&OP anymore, since we've got lots of new AI tools at our disposal? Is S&OP just outdated and something that's not really required by organizations anymore?
Yeah, I would say on the contrary. So on the one hand, I believe S&OP has failed upon its promise. At the other hand, I think it it is more than ever a crucial and essential process for companies to balance. In my books, I talk about the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. And so one of the ways to connect the different corners of that triangle is the S&OP process. So I say we've proven to ourselves that the supply chains that we've built pre-COVID, and supply chain is the physical supply chain. It's also where we source from, where we produce, our distribution networks. But supply chain is also supply chain processes and supply chain capabilities like S&OP processes, knowledge on how to drive these processes and the right tooling. So for me, we've proven to ourselves that what we've built pre-COVID has not been capable to deal with the COVID volatility. Yeah? So instead of doubting whether S&OP is bad, yeah, we need to upgrade our capabilities. And if I ask companies like, what is your current S&OP maturity? People would say it's maybe level 1, level 2. What type of maturity do you need? People would say maybe we need to go to level 3, or we need to go to level 4. And there I say I disagree. I'm convinced that each and every one of us needs to get to level 5. Why? What is level 5? Level 5 maturity means I'm connected to key customers and key suppliers. And level 5 also means I can make value-based decisions. And then I challenge executive teams. I say, tell me in these volatile times how you will drive your supply chain if you're not connected to key customers and key suppliers, and if you can't make value-based decisions. So instead of hesitating whether we need S&OP, no, we need to be very determined that we don't just need an S&OP, we need a level 5 S&OP. And we will need to make dramatic investments in upgrading our supply chain capabilities to be able to better deal with the volatility. And if we're looking for proof, the COVID period is full of proof. Yeah? The service damage we had, the wrong inventories we have been buying, the expediting we have been doing, we've literally been throwing money out of the window in multiple ways by a lack of sufficiently refined, sufficiently agile, sufficiently responsive planning processes.
I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about, a couple of points I want to dig into a little bit. You talked a little bit about value-based decisions, and and also companies throwing away millions of dollars. I think in the past, companies threw away millions of dollars in cost, but what happened over the last 3 years is that companies have thrown millions of dollars away in revenue, which I think is different. And that leads me on to what you were describing about value-based decisions. Do you feel that S&OP should be actually looking at the impact that decisions make on a proper business scorecard, looking at revenue, the impact of decisions on revenue, as well as on the typical supply chain metrics? Is that what you mean by value-based decisions?
Yeah, I would say absolutely yes. Very practically speaking, discussions I have with companies is that I say finance has their own planning processes. We call them FP&A processes, financial planning and analysis. I can no longer accept that finance is running planning processes which are disconnected from operational planning processes. If you look at what happened in COVID, so really in the beginning, we scaled down supply chains, then the demand turned back. We had to scale up supply chains. And also last year, I would say like till mid of last year, many companies were raw material or capacity constrained, but then demand started dropping. So the speed with which we have to accelerate supply chains or decelerate supply chains. So the acceleration is becoming so big, yeah? And also the time between the acceleration and the deceleration in the supply chain, the events come so fast that, yeah, if you don't understand the financial impact, for me it really becomes poor management. And here again, it's an example where the technology is there. Tools can perfectly load, yeah, financial data from a bill of material, and the routing, it's already in the same ERP system. And planning tools can easily then, based on standard costs or more advanced costs, show what is the impact of a planning decision. So the reason why we're not doing it today is because finance doesn't trust supply chain and doesn't want to rely on a supply chain process. And I would say, well, maybe that was acceptable as a practice 10 or 15 years ago, but it's no longer acceptable today. And it's something, yeah, where I think it's something where supply chain needs to show leadership and start that discussion in the executive team. But there will a lot of education will need to be done. And yeah, the fact that S&OP has not been successful in the past certainly doesn't help, because CFOs tend to stay away from anything which is risky. And if you look at the historical performance of S&OP, it hasn't always been over a bed of roses. So we will need to do a lot of education and a lot of convincing on, yeah, why we need to do it and why we need to do it now.
Do you see a risk that you mentioned about, CFOs see this as being risky? Um, and I absolutely agree that, the supply chain is now, a top agenda item. Everyone knows, the CEO, the board, the exec team all know what supply chain is, and the impact of getting the supply chain wrong, how much of an impact that has on the organization. But do you see there's a risk that finance might actually start trying to take over the S&OP?
I think yes, because in the finance function, the traditional roles like accounting are massively disrupted by um, digitalization. Like uh, invoices are no longer keyed in manually. No, they are scanned. Yeah, there's OCR which automatically recognizes the amounts, the suppliers. So I would say that in the finance function there is a complete disintermediation, or there's a disruption. Yeah, so I understand that the finance function is in search of its soul, and for sure they will try to defend their position in the executive team. But okay, it's up to us, to supply chain people, to say no, it's us who know how to balance this triangle, and it's supply chain who has always been doing detailed planning and driving trade-offs between service and cost and inventories. So yeah, we will need to claim that position and claim our seat. Yeah? And I think it would be good for supply chain to get more finance knowledge, because the average supply chain professional doesn't talk the finance language. Also, when I give trainings, I notice that. I think for sure also finance needs to get a better understanding from supply chain. Yeah, and the accountant typically doesn't understand. The controller typically does understand the operations and the supply chain world. Yeah, and I've called on Cupid, Cupid before, to maybe fire some arrows to find a way to make finance and supply chain fall in love. And instead of making it a battle on who takes control of the process, maybe if the two functions would simply work together, that's the more elegant way. But something needs to be done. And if we can if we could link the operational knowledge of supply chain to the stature of finance in the organization, if we could simply combine the two, that's when we would really have an impact.
Yeah, I know that I think, yeah, I think that's a really good comment and a really good observation. Now, when I look at, one of the things that we talked about is the amount of time it takes to pull together the S&OP plan, being in a number of weeks, which is obviously down to the structure. Um, I've I've come to so I've got a hypothesis that one of the big problems is that organizations conflate the meeting cadence, so a monthly S&OP meeting, with the amount of time that it takes to create the S&OP pack. So if it's a monthly meeting, then we finish the S&OP this month and then start on the preparation for next month's S&OP. I feel that in the future that actually we should separate the cadence of the meetings and actually the cadence or how up to date the data is. So almost S&OP data should be continuous, to be continuously updating. And so when we need to have a demand review or a supply review or the S&OP meeting, it's almost done on real-time data, so that you take away that latency with the data production. And for me, that seems to be one of the ways of unlocking S&OP or overcoming one of the big challenges of S&OP. And we can obviously use AI tools and new technology to do that. Do you have a perspective on that as well, about this disconnecting the data in the process and actually the cadence of the process and the number of meetings?
Yeah. What it triggers with me is that S&OP is different from S&OE. So I'm not too concerned with the fact that we update the forecast in week 1 and we only have the S&OP meeting in week 4, because for me S&OP is really about solving the key issues. And take the example of COVID. And so if I look 3, 6, 9 months out and I see that the demand in that horizon is 50% more of the capacity, then please, there is no elegant way to fit 150 into a capacity of 100. Still, that is what companies are doing, even companies that have a so-called S&OP process. So for me, S&OP remains about the rough balancing over the longer horizon and saying, okay, if the demand keeps being 150 and the capacity is only 100, what are we going to do? The last thing to do is not make a decision, allow customers to order 150 and then leave it up to the individual distribution planners or production planners to sort it out. That's creating chaos. That's what I have seen professional companies with a certified level 2 or level 3 S&OP process doing, right? Which is completely irresponsible and poor management. So no, when the demand is when the demand will be sustained 150 and the capacity is only 100, we might decide which customers to cut or which products to cut or to prioritize. And of course, these are not easy decisions, but these are the courageous decisions. And instead of having dissatisfied customers across the board, thinking through which are the customers that we really want to keep happy, not the customer who shouts the loudest, but the customer who is the most strategic and the most important in the longer term. Those are the trade-offs I would expect an executive team to make through an S&OP process. And so if you take that longer horizon, I still believe that a monthly process is good enough. And I'm a big fan of any type of advanced analytics. So I also believe that techniques like AI can come up with much better forecasts based on solid data analysis. But again, AI will not solve the dynamics in the executive team, or AI will not help us to make sure that when we are in a constrained situation, that as an executive team we are making the appropriate decisions. That will remain human intelligence rather than artificial intelligence.
Okay. So, and do you, in the long term, do you see sustainability becoming a topic within the S&OP process?
Yes. So the mental model I use. So in general, again, in my books I talk about supply chain triangle, and I say it's about balancing service, cost, and cash. I'm working on a new book where we're also including where I want to include sustainability in a more native way into the supply chain discussions. And the concept I'm using is a concept coming from the book Donut Economics. And in Donut Economics, they talk about an ecological ceiling and a social foundation. Yeah, so for me, the new challenge of supply chain is you need to balance a triangle of service, cost, and cash, and that's impacting the top line, the margin, and the return on the invested capital. But we increasingly need to do that within smaller boundaries. So the ecological ceiling is going down. 15 years ago, CO2 was not an issue, but each year we need to reduce the CO2, yeah? And the social foundation is coming up. Yeah? We no longer want to source from any type of supplier. When we source from a supplier, we want to make sure that supplier is socially responsible, yeah? Has healthy working conditions, also is not doing any type of pollution. So it also means in the S&OP meeting, we need to understand the impact. Yeah, when we are trying to balance that triangle, how could it potentially conflict with objectives on CO2 reduction, or when we are sourcing from an outside supplier, or when we are switching to dual sourcing instead of single sourcing? Yeah, what type of suppliers are we certain of that have applied certain rules and have certain certificates by recognized audits here, and that in itself might have an impact on the cost. So I think that sustainability for sure has a big impact on, yeah, it basically defines the parameter within which we can operate our supply chains. Another example, I say the COVID period has been very bad from a CO2 perspective. Why? Because I've seen many companies putting things on air freight which really don't belong on air freight, right? So we've
I think we've
we
seen that.
yeah, in all our firefighting, we've been making silly costs just to be able to close the service gap and manage that top line gap that you talked about. But it had a huge impact on the CO2 that we've been spitting out as companies. So having that integrated overview and that integrated dashboard, I think it's a key need, but I haven't seen it in practice. So um, I think it's in the average S&OP meeting, it's already difficult to have an integrated view on service cost and cash. Set aside that in that same view, or when we run a scenario, that we can also understand what would be the impact on the CO2 and any socially related metrics. But okay, it's not because we're not there that it's clearly not the way to go. And again, when I write books, or when we try to educate organizations, yeah, we try to plant the flag and try to show the way on which direction to take and which mental models can be used to better understand how to integrate the different dimensions.
And I guess that's part of doing that is achieving the sort of maturity level 5. You can only look at those, as you say, it's hard enough as it is within the current triangle. So it probably supports what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think I think Gardner would do good to extend the maturity scale, because um, because if you have a scale of 5, people think that 3 will be good enough. Also, if you look at sustainability, the maturity level 1 to 5 doesn't really make the link to sustainability. So if we would say, hey, level 5 means that we control the financial impact and we can make value-based decisions, well, maybe a level 6 would be that we say we can do that, but we also understand, for instance, the CO2 impact in the extended supply chain. And I would agree that it's a next level of maturity, because if we truly want to understand the CO2 impact, there's a lot more data we need to gather. I'm a big fan of extending that scale to a level 10. That will people that then it will look very silly if you are still at level 1 or level 2, and that might actually, we have a good idea here, Matt. That might be the easiest way to explain this to a CEO, that we really need to get to level 5. It's extending the scale to a level 10.
Maybe that's a good idea. So anyway, we're just a very last question for you. So, if you were the chief supply chain officer of the world, what would be your first priority for transforming the world supply chain?
I'm in big favor of changing the role of supply chain in organizations, and like today, the role of supply chain is semi-operational. we typically still have logistics, we still have customer service, and we might have S&OP as our best take at influencing the executive team. And again, I'm starting from that supply chain triangle, and if I look at COVID, it has been a complete mess. We really messed up. We messed up big time, and the financial impact has been everywhere. So I'm done with it. My new mental model is that we say, okay, if we want to better balance that triangle, we need to have a stronger balancing function, because sales is typically more service oriented, operations will be more cost oriented, and it's typically finance who is pulling on the cash side of that triangle. They are really cash flow oriented. And if we want balance, and the balance is key because it's about driving value, we need somebody really in the middle of the triangle, and that should be supply chain. And my advice to supply chain is, let go of logistics and customer service. These are operational functions, right? Give them to the COO. It's operations. Yeah. We already have S&OP. We should claim financial planning, because anyway we need to integrate the two, and we should also claim the strategic planning, right? So that the chief supply chain officer becomes the chief planning officer. Does that mean that supply chain will define the strategy of the company? No. Yeah. Just like in S&OP, supply chain is not defining the forecast. Yeah. Sales is defining the forecast. In the strategy process, it can be sales who decides, okay, which markets to enter with what type of proposition. But also in the strategic planning process, it's up to supply chain to challenge and to say, do you really believe we will be able to drive these type of volumes in that type of markets at those type of prices? And their operations, do you really believe this is the supply chain we need? Don't we need something more agile, because yeah, the predictability of the demand is very low here in this case. So better challenging will lead to a better alignment across the three corners of the triangle. And to make things worse for the rest of the organization, my proposal is also to give a veto right to supply chain. So supply chain should get a veto right and say, no, we are not going to put that into the forecast, or no, we are not going to just keep producing when there is no demand. Yeah? And the basis to put the veto, yeah, should be the overall balance and an overall financial metric, like, okay, what's the margin we will generate over our invested capital? So more a financial metric. And if we do that, yeah, I'm sure we will design our supply chains in a much smarter way. We will run them in a much smarter way. And instead of being very reactive firefighters, supply chain people will become more proactive business managers. That's probably the new type of uh, role. And I think we will not only have a huge financial impact from that perspective, but from that same role, we will also have a key contribution to sustainability objectives. So if I would be the CSEO of the world, and I would be able to define like an axioma or a new law which is by default accepted by everyone, that's the law I would write, Matt.
For us long-term supply chain sort of experts, I think that's is a great ambition. I like the name Chief Planning Officer.
Yeah.
Well, Bram, thank you very much. Has been a fascinating conversation. Many thanks for listening today to today's Big Ideas in Supply Chain podcast. If you'd like to know more about Bram, please find a link in the podcast bio. And we look forward to welcoming you to upcoming Big Ideas in Supply Chain podcasts. Thank you.